Who knew holiday ghost stories could be so much fun? We have another author here for you with another great story. Tonight is Martha Allard, and she's reading from her book Psychic Surgery, which is just incredible, by the way. So what I want you to do is sit back and get ready for the Victorian tradition of telling ghost stories. We're doing it here with Witch's Tea Flint. Let's listen now.
Hi, welcome to my kitchen. Tonight I'm going to read you a ghost story from my collection of short fiction called Psychic Surgery. The name of the story is End of an Era. Not this, Brian thought as he climbed through what had been the iron gates of Queen of Angels Cemetery, now a twisted heap of scrap. It wouldn't outlive this. Queen of Angels was 100 years old, ancient by Hollywood standards. Its monuments had lasted through talkies, color processes, the birth of the studio system, the death of the studio system, and television. Some even outlasted the celluloid itself. More than one headstone in the oldest section read King of Hollywood under a name no one remembered because the King's films had rotted in their cans. Queen of Angels looked just like the rest of the city today. The quake damage was so bad that Brian had to stop a minute to get his bearings. The cemetery's rolling hills had erupted, toppling stones, cracking graves open. Fires in the city below left the late afternoon sky mud-colored. Wind scattered cinders like fireflies from hell. Brian picked his way up the main road, trying to shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Nobody here but his dead folks, his imagination teased, as he reached the grave he was looking for. He slung his shoulder bag to the ground. I'm not in there, kid. Relax. Brian stiffened at the sound of a voice in the wreckage. He thought of the gun stowed in his bag, but slowly straightened, keeping his hands in sight. Go ahead and look if you don't believe me. Brian took a step toward the ruptured grave. The sod was torn open, and broken pieces of concrete vault were visible. The casket itself surfaced, but its seal was intact. The massive onyx monuments had shifted and split. Brian knew it once read, loving father and husband, but those words were lost, leaving only Roger Peregrine, 1922, 1957. The voice behind him clicked with the name. I'm just here for the scotch, if the story's true. Brian's voice sounded as dry as dead leaves. A deep, rich laugh rolled out around him. There was no mistaking that laugh. He'd heard it 1,000 times on screen. Brian turned, and there was Roger Peregrine, not a watercolor ghost, not a rotted corpse, but Roger, as if he descended from some forgotten movie screen and escaped the theater. A case went into the casket. His smile was blinding. I know. Brian's throat was still dry. So it was true. They had buried the scotch with Roger. Brian was grounded again, feeling a rush of panic. You're tired, he thought. And when you're tired, you can see things sometimes. Real or not, Brian had no intention of robbing a man's grave while he watched. For a long second, they stared at each other. Brian checked what stood in front of him with the publicity stills in his memory. There was no hint of gray or thinning in Roger's sandy hair, and his face possessed none of the alcoholic puffiness it had at the end of his life. This Roger matched the movie posters right down to his technicolor blue eyes. Kid, tell me something. Brian heard remnants of Australia in his voice this time. What happened here? Don't you know? Brian tore his eyes away from Peregrine to scan the broken surroundings. This was the big one, the real big one. LA's gone. After all this time, I stopped believing it would ever happen. Roger's voice faded as he looked around. Everyone I know has been gone for years, anyway. Yeah? Brian's voice was bitter. I guess I know how you feel. Come on, kid, let's open that scotch and drown our sorrows. What else have you got to do? Roger moved around the grave, examining it. Did you bring something to pry this with? Brian fished the crowbar out of his bag and handed it over. He looked away as Peregrine opened his own grave, as though it were some private ceremony. "How did you know about this, anyway?" Peregrine asked, jimmying the bar under the lid. "You a fan?" Brian wanted to say that he decided to make movies, decided to come to Hollywood when he was 10, stuck in bed with a fever, watching Forrest Rogue on Afternoon Feature. He was hooked. After that, he'd seen all of Roger's movies, read everything he could about his life. Now that he had the chance to explain the piece of Roger Peregrine he carried, the words log-jammed in his throat. "I've read a lot about you." There was a crack as Roger broke into the casket. "Ah, you see?" He reached in to pull out a fifth. "Horrendous, most of those bloody books." "What about the one you wrote?" Peregrine gave an elegant shrug as he rounded the grave to sit under an old oak that stood untouched amid the destruction. "A little man in a gray suit came to see me with a check and a piece of paper to sign. The check was for a good deal of money, and I was too drunk to work. No one would have me. I signed the paper. Within 6 months, the money was gone, and my brand new autobiography was on the shelf." "You signed your rights away." "I sold the very last thing I had of value." "Your life," Brian said softly. "Not my life. My name," Peregrine corrected, opening the bottle and offering it. "Probably good I did it while it was still worth something." Brian took a healthy swallow, expecting to be jolted out of this bizarre dream. The scotch burned a velvet path down his throat, but the cemetery didn't melt away. Neither did Roger. Brian studied him in profile for a long moment while his mind grasped for and rejected several possibilities. The most comforting one, that the stress of the last 2 days had driven him nuts, was no longer acceptable. This was real. Peregrine was real. Brian could feel it. "Listen," he wanted to touch Peregrine's arm to see for sure that it was solid. "I really need to know what you're doing here." Roger laughed, another one of those old Hollywood party laughs. "Same as you, sport." He held the bottle out to read the label. "This is 50-year-old scotch." "That isn't what I meant." "I know." Roger paused for a drink. "What you meant." "It's kind of funny," Brian said. "The scotch wasn't making things better, but it made them easier." "What is?" "When I first moved here, out from the Midwest, I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any place to go. Spent a lot of time up here." "In the cemetery?" "At your grave." Brian took the bottle from him for a long drink, aware, for the first time, of how strange that sounded. "Seems kind of stupid now that I know what I know." "Why did you come here?" Brian shrugged. Again, it was impossible to tell Roger how he felt about him. "If you didn't die, then what?" Roger reached into his pocket for a silver cigarette case. He took out a Lucky Strike and lit it. "Yes, what? Or should I let me try that again. Yes, what? Or, I suppose the actual question is why?" Brian breathed in the smoke Roger exhaled, hair at the back of his neck prickling. Roger stood and began walking away from the grave. Brian collected his bag and climbed to his feet to follow. The sun bled away, taking the weak afternoon light with it. There would be no moon tonight. The blanket of smoke on the sky was too thick. Roger led him back to what had been the street. Brian thought of all the times Hollywood had annihilated itself on screen. Reality was quieter, far sadder than Brian imagined. They climbed toward what had been the most impressive monument in Queen of Angels. The mausoleum was a replica of the Sphinx. It was erected as a final resting place for some silent film actress. She was one of a whole generation of stars that hadn't survived Warner Brothers' threat of talkies. She outlived her career by decades and had been buried in the Egyptian costume from her greatest role, Nefertiti. Roger picked his way over a wrought iron fence that lay uprooted in the grass. He waited for Brian to follow, then climbed the steps. At the top, they surveyed the wreckage in the dying sunlight. The quake had done more damage to this Sphinx than Napoleon's gunner had done its inspiration in Egypt. The front of the building had split. Half the face crumbled away. The crypt was open, but the dim light left it in shadow. Brian was grateful he'd seen enough open graves. Roger began talking again. I thought at first that it was a second chance. He paused to light another cigarette. I was free of my darling wife, of my failing health. What could be more perfect? Brian took a slug of scotch. It was making things fuzzy around the edges. Roger Peregrine, back from the dead. It did seem perfect. So, what happened? Peregrine sat on the mausoleum steps and cleared a space for Brian. Excuse me. While I was becoming my old self again, Hollywood was changing. It seemed my Hollywood was buried with me. Brian sat next to him. When you died, they called it the end of an era. And so it was. Roger took a drag on his lucky strike. So it was. The 50s, television, people changed. They lost their sense of romance, and it killed my kind of movies. The studios had to keep up. Brian felt the other man's regret on the air between them. What was it like before all that? Oh, it was spectacular back then. Roger's voice turned warm. Back then, anything was possible. All you had to do was be in the right place at the right time. Women were angels, men heroes. We were all immortal. Miracles were performed every day, always on time, and never over budget. Brian closed his eyes. The Hollywood of his mind's eye rose in the darkness. It was the place Brian had been looking for all his life. He'd just come to town 40 years too late. And then the big one hit and flattened everything. I wish... The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. He wished that he could have been here with Roger. Gone, sport. Roger took the bottle from Brian and rolled it between his palms. It's all been gone for decades, and now there's nothing left of it. Brian whispered, staring at the dim orange fires in the distance. You're wrong. What made this place can't be destroyed so easily. Look here. Roger reached a hand out to touch Brian's forehead. Brian flinched back, but not fast enough. It tingled, no, burned, really. It wasn't painful, more like the fire of a new idea that gets spoken out loud and beaten down by compromise. Brian had almost forgotten. Then the sensation cooled too fast and left bitterness in his chest. It turned to sharp laughter. You don't know anything about me. You came here to say goodbye then, Roger asked, and truly give it up. Can you? Conflicting answers flashed in Brian's mind. Yes, no, what other choice was there? Instead, he turned it around. What do you get out of this? Roger smiled and moved so he could look into the Sphinx's ruined face. I knew her. Did you know? When I first arrived here from Melbourne, she befriended me during my days as a stock player. I didn't know. Brian wondered how many other corrupted graves represented lost friends, lost loves to Roger. Even then, at the end of her life, she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Roger moved to the crypt entrance, reached up to touch the crack above the doorway. Is it true the Sphinx has her face? Brian asked, looking up too, trying to imagine that half-face in flesh. Oh yes, Roger said, but it was like her films, a candle flicker of what she really was. Now, the films are gone, the tomb is gone, and not even you remember her name. I'm sorry. Yes, I suppose that is what I get out of convincing you to go on. I get to live. There was silence between them. Roger dropped his cigarette to the step and crushed it beneath his boot. I get to live, he repeated. Brian, you have what built this place in you. Movies live behind your eyes. I see them, I feel them, and the pieces of me in them. Make your movies, and I get to live. My name won't fade from this place like she has. Brian stared at the other man, Roger Peregrine, back from the dead. Instantly, an army of images played out in the dark in his mind. We could make... Roger didn't look at him. Not Wii Sport. That can't be. But if I had you, Brian didn't finish. Something was happening to Roger. He looked two-dimensional to Brian now, flickering like an image projected by weak light. The faint scent of vinegar came to Brian, growing stronger until it almost overpowered the smoke. When Roger sat back down next to Brian, the odor almost choked him. Nitrate decomposition, Roger explained, turning to face him. It was as if the details of his face were fading. A dark halo appeared at the edges, moving in. Everything breaks down, Brian, even film. You know this. No, he protested, as though saying it would stop it. You wanted to live. This time Roger's laugh was tinny, scratchy. His image rippled and jumped. In you, Sport. Roger just stopped. There was no exit scene, no credits. The city below still burned, pouring smoke into the sky. The sound of car alarms sang to Brian faintly, accompanied by a siren every so often. Already, he thought, the place was starting to rebuild itself. He climbed to his feet as the sky began to lighten. Dawn, he thought, or sort of. He gathered up his bag and bottle before turning away from the Sphinx. On the bottom step, his toe connected with something metal and sent it clattering across the littered cement. He bent to retrieve it and smiled. He turned over the small silver film can in his hands. In the pale gray light, he read the label, End of an Era. The film inside was long past running on any projector. Brian climbed the steps again to leave it as an offering in the doorway of Nefertiti's tomb. The end. Thank you very much. And, play the game. And I will send whoever wins the drawing a book signed. If you're curious to know anything about this story, I will tell you this. A friend of mine who did live in Hollywood and worked in the films told me a story about Errol Flynn having a case of scotch buried with him. And Brian always said that, if the big one hit, his plan was good to go to where Flynn was buried. And if the grave was open, he would drink a shot in Flynn's honor on the grave amid the destruction of Los Angeles. So that's the real story behind the ghost story. Thanks very much.
Wow, that was such a great story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Martha. Wow. Do you want to win a copy of Psychic Surgery? Well, here's what you need to do. You have to like this post and you have to comment on this post. Give an impression what you thought about the book. Talk about how much you like that we're doing these ghost stories. And then we will draw a winner on Friday.